June 26, 1943. The skies over northern France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson watches his own cockpit fill with smoke. His hydraulics fail, and his canopy jams shut. And somewhere behind him, a German fighter pilot is circling back for the kill he believes he has already delivered. Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt has just absorbed what should be a fatal beating. A cannon shell has torn through his oxygen system. Machine gun rounds have shredded his rudder, punched through his canopy, and set fire to the ammunition bay behind his seat. His control panel is a smoking ruin. Blood runs down his face from shrapnel wounds he barely registers in the chaos. 22 years old, from Lawton, Oklahoma, Johnson had joined the Army Air Forces, convinced he would fly the sleek, celebrated fighters that dominated recruitment posters and newsreel footage, only to find himself assigned instead to an aircraft so large and unfashionable that fellow pilots openly questioned whether Republic Aviation's engineers had accidentally built a bomber instead of a fighter. By every rule of aerial combat in 1943, this aircraft should already be a fireball tumbling toward the French countryside, and its pilot should already be dead. Instead, Johnson is still flying, still fighting to nurse his shattered fighter back across the English Channel, and the German pilot bearing down on him for a final pass is about to learn something about the aircraft American flyers have started calling, with equal parts affection and frustration, the Jug, while the Luftwaffe pilots who first encountered it over Europe dismissed it, with open contempt, as nothing more than a flying barn. To understand why this single afternoon over northern France matters so profoundly, you have to understand the deep skepticism that greeted the P-47 Thunderbolt when it first arrived in the European theater in early 1943. Designed by Alexander Kartveli and built by Republic Aviation on Long Island, New York, the Thunderbolt is, by any conventional measure of fighter aircraft design in the era, an enormous, almost absurd machine. Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had fled the Russian Revolution and eventually found his way to American aviation, approached fighter design with a philosophy that ran counter to the prevailing wisdom of the era, prioritizing raw power, structural durability, and high-altitude performance over the lightweight agility that had defined most successful fighter designs since the First World War. Weighing in at over 7 tons fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of the sleek, agile fighters the Luftwaffe has built its reputation around, the P-47 towers over other single-engine fighters of the war. Its massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 radial engine and 11-foot propeller giving it a bulk that earns immediate derision from pilots on both sides of the conflict. German pilots, accustomed to facing the nimble Supermarine Spitfire and the equally agile American P-40, take one look at the Thunderbolt's bulbous fuselage and dismiss it outright, coining the mocking nickname that will follow the aircraft through its earliest months in combat. Der fliegende Scheunentür, or more colloquially among Allied pilots translating the sentiment, the flying barn door, a machine seemingly built more for hauling cargo than for winning dogfights against Germany's finest fighter pilots. German fighter tactics developed against earlier, lighter American aircraft rely heavily on exploiting superior maneuverability in tight, sustained turning fights, and Luftwaffe pilots initially approached the Thunderbolt using exactly these same assumptions, expecting the oversized American fighter to prove just as vulnerable to their proven tactics as every previous Allied fighter they had encountered. Instructors within German fighter training units, briefing new pilots rotating into frontline squadrons throughout early 1943, initially described the American newcomer in dismissive terms, consistent with the broader Luftwaffe assessment, warning pilots against nothing more than the aircraft's size, while offering little indication that its underlying construction represented any genuine tactical concern worth special preparation. The skepticism is not confined to the enemy. American pilots transitioning into the P-47 from smaller, more nimble aircraft expressed their own doubts about a fighter so large it seems to defy the basic principles of aerial combat that have governed fighter design since the First World War. Pilots accustomed to the light responsive handling of trainer aircraft find the Thunderbolt's sheer mass and inertia a genuine adjustment. Its takeoff roll longer, its climb rate initially unimpressive at lower altitudes, and its silhouette so bulky compared to the elegant lines of the Spitfires flying alongside it in England that some pilots privately wonder whether they have been assigned an inferior machine by an Army Air Force's procurement system more concerned with domestic industrial capacity. The 56th Fighter Group, the first American unit to fly the Thunderbolt into combat over Europe, arrives in England in January 1943 under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, a demanding, meticulous commander tasked with proving that this oversized, unconventional aircraft can actually hold its own against the battle-tested Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s that have dominated the skies over Western Europe for years. Zemke, a career officer with a reputation for rigorous, almost obsessive attention to training and tactics, recognizes early that the Thunderbolt's unfamiliar handling characteristics demand an entirely different approach to aerial combat than the tight-turning fights favored by lighter fighters. And he spends the group's earliest weeks in England drilling his pilots relentlessly in tactics built around the P-47's genuine strengths: diving speed, high-altitude performance, and the ability to disengage from unfavorable fights rather than getting drawn into the close-quarters turning battles where German fighters held every advantage. Zemke's pilots, many of them fresh from flight training and eager to prove themselves against Germany's elite fighter squadrons, initially share the broader skepticism about their unusual new mount, uncertain whether its sheer size represents a fatal handicap or a hidden advantage nobody has yet fully understood. Early combat encounters through the spring of 1943 do little to fully resolve this uncertainty, the group scoring some successes while also suffering losses that suggest the P-47's true combat potential remains, for the moment, only partially understood, even by the men flying it every day, a period of trial and adjustment during which the aircraft's ultimate reputation still hangs genuinely in the balance. What none of them yet know, not the German pilots sneering at its ungainly silhouette, not the American pilots wondering if they have been handed an inferior aircraft, not even the engineers at Republic Aviation who designed it, is that the very qualities making the Thunderbolt look so laughably oversized in the air are about to become the aircraft's single greatest weapon. Kartveli himself, watching his design absorb this early wave of skepticism from pilots on both sides of the conflict, reportedly maintained a quiet confidence throughout this period that the very engineering choices drawing so much ridicule would eventually prove decisive, a conviction rooted less in blind optimism than in a genuine engineering understanding of exactly what his aircraft's structural margins and air-cooled engine architecture made possible under combat conditions nobody had yet fully tested. Robert Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group's 61st Fighter Squadron, is about to become living proof of exactly what that oversized, heavily built airframe can survive. But first, on the afternoon of June 26, 1943, he has to survive it himself. Will the aircraft the Germans mock as a flying barn prove them catastrophically wrong? Or will it become just another statistic in a war already consuming young pilots by the thousands? Robert Johnson's squadron takes off from RAF Manston on the afternoon of June 26, 1943, tasked with escorting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses on a bombing mission deep into occupied France, one of the increasingly ambitious escort operations the 56th Fighter Group has been flying, as American commanders push the range and reach of their fighter cover further into German-controlled airspace. The mission itself reflects the broader strategic challenge facing American bomber operations in the summer of 1943. Without adequate fighter escort, capable of accompanying bombers deep into enemy territory, German fighters have repeatedly savaged unescorted American bomber formations, and every additional mile of effective escort range the Thunderbolt squadrons can provide translates directly into fewer bombers lost and fewer American aircrew killed or captured over hostile territory. As Johnson's flight engages a formation of German fighters rising to intercept the bomber stream, His aircraft becomes separated from his squadron mates in the swirling, chaotic maneuvering that characterizes aerial combat at this stage of the war. A dangerous isolation that any fighter pilot understands can prove fatal within seconds against an experienced enemy. That enemy arrives in the form of Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished and tactically innovative fighter pilots. Already credited with dozens of aerial victories and known throughout the German fighter force for pioneering head-on attack tactics against American bomber formations. Meyer, a commander of Jagdgeschwader II, who had developed his signature head-on attack technique specifically to exploit the limited forward-firing defensive armament of American heavy bombers, represents exactly the kind of experienced, tactically sophisticated opponent capable of exploiting any genuine weakness in an isolated American fighter, making Johnson's predicament all the more dangerous given the caliber of pilot now closing in on him. Meyer, flying a Focke-Wulf FW-190, spots Johnson's isolated Thunderbolt and closes for what should be, by every reasonable expectation of 1943 aerial combat, a straightforward kill against a lone, disadvantaged opponent. Meyer's opening burst tears into Johnson's aircraft with devastating effect, cannon shells and machine gun rounds ripping through the Thunderbolt's fuselage, wings and cockpit area in a sustained attack that would reduce almost any other fighter aircraft of the era to flaming wreckage within seconds. Johnson's cockpit becomes a nightmare of destruction almost instantaneously. Shrapnel and shattered plexiglass tear across his face and hands, drawing blood that mixes with sweat as he struggles to maintain control of an aircraft whose instruments are rapidly failing around him. The violence of the attack leaves Johnson momentarily disoriented, his ears ringing from the impact of cannon rounds striking home, his vision partially obscured by blood and the acrid smoke now filling the cockpit, forcing him to rely as much on instinct and muscle memory as on any clear assessment of exactly how badly his aircraft has been damaged. A cannon round punctures his oxygen system, forcing him to descend to lower altitude before hypoxia can claim him entirely. His hydraulic system, essential for operating his flaps, landing gear, and other critical controls, is shredded beyond function, leaving him to fly and eventually land using nothing but raw mechanical linkages and improvised technique. Perhaps most terrifying of all, his canopy jams shut during the attack, trapping him inside an aircraft that, for all he knows in these desperate seconds, could erupt into flame at any moment, sealed inside a cockpit he has no way to escape from if the fire spreads. Meyer, watching his rounds tear into the American fighter, breaks off his attack convinced he has scored a kill. The sheer volume of visible damage inflicted on Johnson's Thunderbolt more than sufficient, by any conventional standard, to guarantee the aircraft's destruction. German pilots of Meyer's experience and caliber rarely misjudge the severity of damage inflicted on an enemy aircraft. Their assessment built on years of accumulated combat experience, watching how different aircraft types respond to gunfire, and by every metric Meyer would have relied upon, Johnson's Thunderbolt should already have been finished, its pilot either dead or moments from being forced to bail out over enemy territory. It is precisely at this moment, the moment when a hardened, veteran German ace, with dozens of victories to his name, looks at a shredded American fighter and assumes the fight is already over, that the Thunderbolt's true character begins to reveal itself. Johnson, bleeding, half-blind from shrapnel and fumes filling his cockpit, trapped behind a jammed canopy, somehow keeps his aircraft flying, nursing the shattered Thunderbolt westward toward the English Channel on an engine that, despite everything thrown against it, continues to run. The flight home becomes its own harrowing ordeal, stretching across dozens of miles of hostile airspace, with an aircraft that should not, by any rational assessment, still be airborne. Johnson later describes fighting simply to maintain consciousness and control as his damaged aircraft wallows through the sky, its normally responsive handling reduced to a sluggish, unpredictable fight against control surfaces damaged by the earlier attack. Every mile toward the Channel coast representing another opportunity for a second German fighter to finish what Mayer had started and failed to complete. He recalls monitoring his few remaining functional instruments with growing dread, watching engine temperature gauges he can no longer fully trust, and listening for any change in the engine's note that might signal the imminent failure that logic told him should already have occurred, forcing himself through sheer discipline to keep flying west rather than surrendering to the panic that any rational assessment of his situation would have justified. Remarkably, Johnson's ordeal is not yet finished. A second German fighter, a Bf-109, spots his crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the coast and closes in for what appears to be an easy follow-up kill against an aircraft already streaming smoke and clearly struggling to maintain altitude. This second attack should, by any conventional measure, finally finish what Mayer's initial assault had failed to accomplish. Instead, Johnson's rear gunner position, non-existent on a single-seat fighter, forcing Johnson himself to somehow maneuver his crippled aircraft into a position to defend himself, manages through sheer determination and whatever functional systems remain to discourage the second attacker enough that the German pilot eventually breaks off, whether from damage inflicted, fuel concerns, or simple disbelief that the American fighter remains airborne at all. Johnson, drawing on whatever combat instincts and remaining aircraft responsiveness he can still summon, manages a few desperate evasive maneuvers that, however clumsy compared to his aircraft's normal handling, prove sufficient to convince the second attacker that finishing off this particular target will cost more time and risk than the German pilot considers worthwhile, given the broader mission still unfolding around them. Johnson finally crosses the English coastline and executes a landing that, given the state of his hydraulics and control systems, amounts to a barely controlled crash landing rather than any conventional touchdown, the Thunderbolt skidding to a stop on the runway at RAF Manston, in a condition that stuns the ground crews who rush out to meet it. With his hydraulic system destroyed, Johnson has no reliable way to lower his landing gear through normal means, forced instead to rely on emergency backup systems and sheer improvisation to bring his aircraft down in one piece. A landing that ground crew witnesses later describe as looking less like a fighter returning from a successful mission than like a wounded animal simply collapsing the moment it reached safety. What they find when they finally count the damage becomes one of the most widely repeated stories of the entire air war. More than 200 bullet and shrapnel holes across Johnson's aircraft, an engine that continued running despite catastrophic damage, and a pilot who, against every reasonable expectation of what an aircraft could survive, walks away from the cockpit under his own power. Ground crew chief and armorers, veterans of counting battle damage on returning aircraft throughout the group's earlier combat operations, reportedly stop counting individual holes at some point, simply because the task becomes impractical, settling instead on rough estimates that nonetheless convey, in their sheer scale, exactly how thoroughly Mayer's initial attack should have destroyed the aircraft it instead merely wounded. The sheer scale of destruction visible across the airframe, control surfaces perforated, fuselage panels torn open, systems shredded throughout, becomes, almost overnight, the single most persuasive argument the Thunderbolts advocates could ever hope to offer skeptical pilots and commanders, still uncertain whether this oversized fighter represented a genuine combat asset or simply an oversized target. News of Johnson's survival spreads rapidly through the 56th Fighter Group and beyond, transforming almost overnight the way American and German pilots alike discuss the Thunderbolt's true combat capabilities. Fellow pilots who examined the wreckage of Johnson's aircraft in the days following his return described the experience as genuinely transformative to their own confidence in the type, several later crediting the sight of his shredded but structurally intact Thunderbolt with fundamentally changing how they approached their own combat tactics, no longer flying with the same instinctive wariness about their aircraft's ability to absorb punishment that had characterized the group's earliest months in combat. Squadron commanders throughout the group reportedly begin referencing Johnson's ordeal directly in briefings and informal conversations with newer pilots, using the specific, documented example of an aircraft absorbing over 200 hits and still bringing its pilot home as a concrete counterargument against the lingering doubts some replacement pilots still carried about the aircraft's true combat value. Zemke, already convinced of his aircraft's potential from earlier engagements, seizes on Johnson's ordeal as vivid, undeniable proof of exactly the argument he has been making to skeptical superiors since the group's arrival in England, that the P-47's much-mocked bulk, far from representing a liability, conceals genuine combat advantages no sleeker fighter of the era can match. The Thunderbolt's massive air-cooled radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines powering the Spitfire, the Bf-109, and the P-51 Mustang that will later join the fighter force, can absorb direct hits to individual cylinders and continue running, since damage to one part of the engine's radial arrangement does not necessarily disable the entire power plant, the way a single well-placed round through a liquid cooling system can instantly doom an inline engine fighter. Its heavily reinforced airframe, originally designed to accommodate the sheer size and weight of its engine and armament, incidentally provides a degree of structural resilience against battle damage that lighter, more delicately engineered fighters simply cannot match. Republic Aviation's engineers, designing the aircraft primarily to house the massive turbo supercharger system needed for high-altitude performance, rather than with survivability as a stated primary goal, had inadvertently created a structure whose robust internal framework and generous margins of structural strength happened to translate directly into an aircraft capable of absorbing damage that would tear a more lightly built fighter apart, a fortunate byproduct of engineering choices originally driven by entirely different performance requirements. Word of the Thunderbolt's durability spreads through the Luftwaffe as well, and German pilots begin adjusting their tactics accordingly, no longer approaching the P-47 with the dismissive confidence that had characterized earlier encounters. German fighter pilot debriefings and after-action reports from this period increasingly note the American aircraft's unusual toughness, prompting revised guidance within some Luftwaffe fighter units about the volume of fire genuinely required to guarantee a kill against the type. A tacit acknowledgement that the aircraft once mocked as an oversized target had earned a level of respect few German pilots would have predicted only months earlier. Pilots who had once mocked the aircraft's ungainly silhouette now find themselves forced to reckon with an opponent that, even after absorbing what should be a fatal quantity of gunfire, remains capable of fighting back, forcing German fighter pilots into longer, more sustained engagements that expend far more ammunition and expose them to far greater risk than the quick, decisive kills they had grown accustomed to scoring against less durable Allied aircraft earlier in the war. By the autumn of 1943, the Thunderbolt's reputation has undergone a complete transformation within the American fighter force, evolving from a source of open skepticism into a nickname that reflects genuine hard-won affection. Pilots increasingly call it simply the Jug, a term whose exact origin remains debated, some crediting its resemblance to a milk jug's rounded fuselage, others pointing to its role as a reliable vessel that consistently, almost stubbornly, carries its pilots home. Pilots who once privately questioned their assignment to such an unglamorous-looking aircraft now speak of it with a proprietary pride that would have seemed almost inconceivable only months earlier. Veterans of the group increasingly requesting to remain with the Thunderbolt, even as newer, sleeker fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, begin entering combat and drawing away some of the attention and prestige that once belonged exclusively to more conventionally attractive designs. Combat statistics accumulated across the 56th Fighter Group's mounting tally of aerial victories reinforced the aircraft's growing reputation, the unit under Zemke's leadership becoming one of the most successful fighter groups in the entire 8th Air Force, credited with destroying enemy aircraft at rates that silence most of the lingering skepticism about the Thunderbolt's combat effectiveness. The strategic value of the P-47's durability extends well beyond individual survival stories, however dramatic. As American bomber formations pushed deeper into German-controlled airspace throughout 1943 and into 1944, escort fighters capable of absorbing damage and continuing to fight prove essential to sustaining the increasingly costly air campaign against German industrial targets. Bomber crews themselves, whose survival often depended directly on the presence and effectiveness of their fighter escort, developed their own strong appreciation for the Thunderbolt's reputation. Aircrew accounts from this period frequently describing genuine relief at spotting the distinctive silhouette of P-47 escorts arriving to protect them through the most dangerous stretches of German airspace. An escort whose own well-earned reputation for surviving punishment made its protective presence feel considerably more reassuring than a more fragile fighter type might have offered under the same circumstances. The Thunderbolt's ability to survive punishing battle damage means fewer experienced pilots lost to aircraft failures that might have doomed them in a less rugged fighter, preserving exactly the kind of veteran combat experience that proves irreplaceable as the air war grinds on and casualty rates among less durable aircraft types climb. Loss rates among Thunderbolt squadrons attributable specifically to mechanical or structural failure following battle damage prove consistently lower than comparable figures for other Allied fighter types over the same period. A statistical pattern that 8th Air Force planners increasingly cite when weighing which aircraft to prioritize for the most dangerous escort and ground attack assignments, recognizing that an aircraft's survivability under fire directly translates into retained combat experience among the pilots flying it. Beyond its role as an escort fighter, the P-47's toughness makes it increasingly indispensable for ground attack missions. As the war progresses, its ability to absorb ground fire while strafing German columns, trains, and airfields proving far more valuable for this dangerous, low-altitude work than the more fragile inline engine fighters, whose vulnerable cooling systems make them far more susceptible to catastrophic failure from a single lucky rifle round fired up from the ground. The P-51 Mustang, for all its celebrated speed and long-range escort capability, relies on a liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, whose coolant lines present a persistent vulnerability that ground fire could exploit with far greater ease than the multiple air-cooled cylinders of the Thunderbolt's radial power plant. A design distinction that increasingly shapes which aircraft type gets assigned to the most hazardous low-altitude strafing missions, as Allied commanders come to appreciate the practical consequences of each engine architecture under actual combat conditions. By the time Allied forces land in Normandy in June 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt has become one of the most feared and respected aircraft in the entire European theater, flying thousands of ground attack sorties against German armor, transport, and fortified positions in direct support of advancing Allied troops. Missions that expose the aircraft to intense small arms and anti-aircraft fire from below, precisely the kind of punishment its rugged construction was, almost by accident, uniquely suited to survive. Ground troops advancing through the hedgerows of Normandy and beyond come to recognize the Thunderbolt's distinctive silhouette overhead as a genuine reassurance, its pilots diving repeatedly through curtains of German anti-aircraft fire to deliver rockets, bombs, and strafing runs against enemy positions that conventional artillery struggled to reach. Missions flown at altitudes low enough that a single well-placed round from the ground could, in a less durable aircraft, have proven immediately fatal. Infantrymen calling in close air support learned to trust the Thunderbolt's ability to press home an attack even under heavy return fire, a confidence built directly on the aircraft's accumulated combat reputation. Soldiers on the ground understanding, even without any technical knowledge of radial engine architecture, that the aircraft circling overhead was simply built differently from the fighters that had come before it. German soldiers on the ground, watching Thunderbolts return again and again to strafe their positions despite absorbing hits that would have destroyed lighter aircraft, developed their own grudging respect for a machine they had once dismissed with contempt. Some German accounts from the ground campaign describing the P-47 with a kind of fatalistic dread reserved for an enemy that simply refuses to be discouraged by damage that should, by any reasonable expectation, have ended its usefulness hours or days earlier. Soldiers of the retreating Wehrmacht dug into hedgerows and fortified villages across France in the summer of 1944, learned to recognize the Thunderbolt's distinctive silhouette overhead with a dread that had, only a year earlier, seemed almost unimaginable, given the same aircraft's earliest reputation as an oversized, easily dismissed target. The overall combat record compiled by the Thunderbolt across the entire war stands as its own testament to the aircraft's transformation from mocked, oversized curiosity to indispensable combat asset. American P-47 pilots are credited with destroying more than 3,500 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, while the type's ground attack sorties account for the destruction of thousands of tanks, locomotives, trucks, and other German military targets across every theater where the aircraft saw service, from the skies over Western Europe to the Mediterranean, and in modified form, the Pacific theater as well. Loss rates for the P-47 in the ground attack role, while never negligible given the inherent dangers of low-altitude combat flying, prove consistently lower per sortie than comparable statistics for other Allied fighter bombers pressed into similar duty, a statistical pattern that military analysts studying the aircraft's wartime performance record attribute directly to precisely the structural durability first dramatically demonstrated by Johnson's ordeal over northern France in the summer of 1943. Post-war studies conducted by the Army Air Force's own statistical analysis units, examining thousands of individual combat sorties across multiple aircraft types, consistently identify the Thunderbolt's air-cooled radial engine and reinforced airframe as measurable, quantifiable factors in its comparatively favorable survival statistics, transforming what had once been dismissed as mere pilot anecdote into documented, data-driven confirmation of the aircraft's genuine combat advantages. More than 15,000 Thunderbolts roll off Republic Aviation's production lines before the war's end, making it one of the most numerically significant American fighters of the entire conflict. A production run that reflects not merely the aircraft's combat utility, but the confidence American commanders eventually placed in a design once dismissed, in its earliest months over Europe, as an oversized, ungainly mistake. Republic's factories, along with a secondary production line, established at an Evansville, Indiana plant to meet the demands of an aircraft whose reputation had shifted so dramatically from liability to necessity, work at a sustained pace throughout the war's final 2 years. The sheer scale of production itself standing as an industrial testament to how thoroughly the Thunderbolt's early critics had been proven wrong. Workers on these production lines, many of them women who had entered the aviation manufacturing workforce as men departed for military service, assemble Thunderbolts at a pace that reflects the aircraft's growing strategic importance, each completed fighter representing another contribution to an air campaign that by the war's final 2 years depended heavily on exactly the kind of rugged, damage-tolerant aircraft the P-47 had proven itself to be. Robert Johnson himself survives the war as one of the most successful American fighter pilots of the European theater, credited with destroying more than 24 enemy aircraft before returning home, his June 1943 ordeal over northern France becoming one of the most frequently retold episodes in the entire history of American fighter aviation, cited for decades afterward in training materials, veterans' accounts, and popular histories as the definitive illustration of exactly what the P-47 Thunderbolt could survive. Johnson himself, reflecting on the episode in post-war interviews and his own published memoir, credits the aircraft's rugged construction with saving his life on that single afternoon in terms that leave little room for doubt about where his loyalty ultimately settled among the various American fighter types he would go on to fly and evaluate throughout the remainder of his career, describing the Thunderbolt not merely as a machine he respected professionally, but as the aircraft he personally credited with the simple fact. His memoir, published years after the war, entitled simply Thunderbolt, becomes a touchstone reference for later generations of aviation historians and enthusiasts, seeking a first-hand account of exactly what the aircraft's reputation for durability meant to the men who flew it into combat day after day. The aircraft's legacy extends well beyond its own service record, its rugged, damage-tolerant design philosophy influencing generations of American ground attack aircraft that followed, from the piston-engine fighter bombers of the Korean War era to the modern A-10 Thunderbolt II. An aircraft whose very name deliberately invokes its World War II predecessor's reputation for surviving punishment that would destroy less robust designs, built specifically around the same core philosophy that an aircraft's ability to bring its pilot home safely, even after absorbing catastrophic damage, can matter every bit as much as its speed, its agility, or its firepower. Air Force planners designing the A-10 decades later explicitly cited the original Thunderbolt's wartime reputation as a guiding philosophy, deliberately prioritizing pilot survivability and battle damage tolerance in an era when many contemporary fighter designs instead emphasize speed and technological sophistication above all else. A direct intellectual lineage connecting Robert Johnson's shattered cockpit over France to cockpits flown decades later in entirely different wars. What the story of the Thunderbolt ultimately reveals is a broader truth about how quickly first impressions in war can prove not merely wrong, but catastrophically misleading. The German pilots who mocked the P-47 as a flying barn were judging the aircraft by the same aesthetic and tactical standards that had defined fighter combat for 2 decades. Speed, agility, the sleek elegance of an aircraft built to dance through the sky rather than absorb punishment. Those same assumptions had served the Luftwaffe extraordinarily well throughout the early years of the war, its pilots and aircraft designers having built a formidable reputation on precisely the kind of nimble, lightweight fighter doctrine that made the Thunderbolt's bulk seem, at first glance, like an obvious and almost comical liability, rather than the calculated trade-off it actually represented. What they failed to anticipate was that the coming era of aerial warfare, increasingly defined by massed bomber formations, sustained escort missions, and low-altitude ground attack against heavily defended targets, would reward a different set of virtues entirely: resilience, survivability, and the simple, stubborn refusal to fall out of the sky, no matter how thoroughly an enemy believed the fight was already over. Robert Johnson's shattered Thunderbolt, limping home across the English Channel on June 26, 1943, carrying more than 200 holes and a pilot who refused to die, stands as history's answer to every enemy who ever mistook a machine's appearance for its true measure. A reminder that the things built to endure, however unglamorous they may first appear, often outlast the things built merely to impress.